Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Did the great author of horror and science fiction, H.P. Lovecraft, know more than he let on about the multiverse? Because quantum physics suggests that all possible worlds are real, could Lovecraft's characters such as Cthulhu and the unnameable Hastur actually exist? I like that, the unnameable Hastur. Could books like the Necronomicon or the Narcotic manuscripts be real?
Well, hello there, and welcome to the 375th broadcast of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. And those questions, from the edge, came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad.
This evening we are pleased to honor the memory of the 20th century's probably greatest author of horror and fantasy fiction, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, known to his friends as HPL. Lovecraft was born right here in Rhode Island, in Providence, in 1890, and lived most of his life here. He was a seventh cousin of your humble co-hosts through the Whipple family on his mother's side.
So many of Lovecraft's stories, especially the ones written between 1926 and the mid-1930s, parallel ideas that we see in the multiverse theories of the paranormal that my dad and I use. And in literature, Lovecraft was the first author to develop ideas of total alien creatures living not only on other planets, but in parallel worlds.
At the same time, several literary critics have pronounced Lovecraft his own strangest character. In a time when letter writing, as opposed to email or texting, was still an art, Lovecraft spent enormous amounts of time, and who knows how much postage, on thousands of brilliant and entertaining letters he wrote to his many correspondents, covering every imaginable subject, including, occasionally, quantum physics.
So think of how many more great stories he could have written if he hadn't spent all that time writing letters.
This is what some of the critics say. Now, according to my late mother, Lovecraft even corresponded with my father, a dedicated Lovecraft fan who lived not far away in Hartford, Connecticut, in the 1920s and 30s. Tragically, those letters were lost long ago, so how long they corresponded, what they said, whether they ever met, or whether they even knew they were related, we don't know. By the way, last Monday, August 20th, would have been Lovecraft's 122nd birthday. So we could spend the next 10 shows on Lovecraft as a character. To learn more about the man, I suggest the book H.P. Lovecraft, A Life by S.T. Yoshi, probably the greatest Lovecraft scholar now living, or the chapters on Lovecraft in my own book, written along with Glenn Laxton, Rhode Island, A Genial History. There are hundreds of other sources, as any online search will show, many books, many articles. But let's move on to the multiverse, what Lovecraft knew and when he knew it.
So, hold on a minute there. Before we continue into the multiverse of Lovecraft, it's time for a weekly paranormal contest. So, after destroying your brilliant monologue, last week's question was, if you got lost in Scape or Swamp, what creature would you run into?
Well, a number of people tried and failed to get the answer to that one. The lizard man, who supposedly lives in Scape or Swamp and other wetlands in and around Lee County, South Carolina.
The answer was just too simple, I suppose.
I guess. Well, I don't know. But that's not far from Lancaster County, where your mom's family comes from.
Oh, yeah, that is true.
So, well, anyway. Excuse me.
But we are related to the lizard man, too, I suppose.
Well, if we're related to Lovecraft, I suppose we could be related to the lizard man.
Yeah, well, you can be related to anybody, I suppose. If you go back far enough.
The vagaries of human genealogy.
Indeed. So, anyway, this week we have a Lovecraftian question for you. In what Lovecraft story is the creature known as Vunuth? Is that?
Vunith.
Vunith, sorry.
You know, it's one of your favorite stories.
I know. Mentioned. Be first to get that right and win a copy of Rhode Island, A Genial History by Paul F. Eno and Glenn Laxton.
Well, we do welcome calls this evening, especially from Lovecraft fans, or even if you'd like to become a Lovecraft fan, there's always room for more. The numbers locally or from Canada, 401-766-1240, or from anywhere in the U.S., 800-449-1240.
All right, so here's a quote from one of Lovecraft's most famous stories, The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926.
The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be, not in the spaces we know, but between them they walk serene and primal, undimensioned, and to us unseen. Okay, so that's the call of Cthulhu. Of course, the pronunciation of Cthulhu or Cthulhu or whatever is really, it's spelled Cthulhu, but Lovecraft went to great pains in his somewhat jocular letters to say it was not meant to be pronounced by human vocal cords, because he was very much into the other and the alien in his stories. So anyway, we'll get more into that. In a story called The Dreams in the Witch House, written in 1932, a luckless student at Lovecraft's fictional Miskatonic University in fictional Arkham, Massachusetts, ends up rooming in a 235-year-old house that reminds us of the crazy case in Connecticut that Ben and I have been working on for the last 7 years. Worlds seem to blend, time and space bend and stretch, and odd figures come and go. In that story, Lovecraft talks about the student who bears the good old New England name of Walter Gilman and his studies in math and physics. Lovecraft even mentions by name some of the early headliners in quantum physics: Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Albert Einstein, and Willem de Sitter. Now, throughout his stories, Lovecraft suggests that we shouldn't learn more about reality than is good for us. Here's another quote: "Non-Euclidean calculus and whatever that means, and quantum physics are enough to stretch any brain. And when one mixes them with folklore and tries to trace a strange background of multidimensional reality behind the ghoulish hints of gothic tales and the wild whispers of the chimney corner, one can hardly expect to be wholly free from mental tension." Unquote. Now that sounds a lot like what we say on this show when we talk about who's really behind or what's really behind human folklore. Now, at her trial, the witch who haunts Gilman's room in this story, The Dreams in the Witch House, quote, had told Judge Hawthorne of lines and curves that could be made to point out directions leading through the walls of space beyond, and had implied that such lines and curves were frequently used at certain midnight meetings in the dark valley of the White Stone behind Meadow Hill and on the unpeopled island in the river, unquote. Now, here's a very apt comment on all this from author and Lovecraft enthusiast Chris Paradis, whose excellent blog you can find at www.chrisparadis, that's CHRISPERIS.blogspot.com. Quote, "Of course, Lovecraft is alluding to Riemannian, that's a Riemann, the physicist, as opposed to Euclidean geometry, and playfully merges it with pentacles and witches' drawings of Kabbalistic sketches. Hawthorne is clearly an allusion, that's allusion, not illusion, not just to the real judge, but to Nathaniel Hawthorne and his witch tales." Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, being the author of The Scarlet Letter and other great New England stories. This is a parody, but as I read this passage, it excited me to realize how often Lovecraft was prescient. In other words, could sort of see, was ahead of his time, could see ideas coming down the pike. Now, years afterward, Feynman would come up with eerie glyphs to illustrate quantum interactions, unquote. Now, of course, Richard Feynman was a 20th century physicist who developed a thought diagram still used today to calculate rates for electromagnetic and weak particle processes. The diagrams provide a convenient shorthand for the calculations. They are a code physicists use to talk to one another about their calculations.
So the odd thing is, Feynman didn't receive his doctorate in physics until 1942, 5 years after Lovecraft's death. And a serious theory of the multiverse wasn't really developed until around 1957, 20 years after Lovecraft's death, until Princeton doctoral candidate in physics Hugh Everett wrote his theses about it. So where did Lovecraft get his ideas about all this stuff at such an early stage?
Well, did H.P. Lovecraft really have some kind of secret knowledge about the multiverse? Did he have access to books that he wrote about as fiction, but that really existed?
Well, the thing is, didn't you mention to me once that he actually thought that was all like poppycock?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to get to that. Don't rush me, son.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't mean to jump the gun.
Okay. I know everybody's anxious about this. Ben and all his friends and I also are Lovecraft fans, so we're kind of psyched about this. Books like the Necronomicon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, That's what he actually called it. Or the Narcotic Manuscripts, or a book called the Unaussprechlichen Kulten, if your German is any good, which actually translates, it's supposed to be unmentionable cults. There was some question about the word Unaussprechlichen. At one point I thought it meant unpronounceable.
Unpronounceable cults.
The words like Cthulhu and all this, that might be. But I guess Unaussprechlichen actually does mean unmentionable or something like that, forbidden or whatever. Lovecraft liked to use words like that. But anyway, did he have some kind of secret knowledge? Well, I don't think so. And if you look at Lovecraft the man, you can begin to see why.
So while he never went to college, Lovecraft spent his entire life around books on many different subjects. His family had a huge private library, and Lovecraft taught himself to read at the age of 4, and he lived most of his life surrounded by the campus of Brown University in Providence, where a monument commemorates him and his work to this day.
Yeah, I was present at the dedication of that monument 22 years ago, I'm happy to say. Anyway, Lovecraft himself was a professed atheist who appears not to have had a spiritualist bone in his body. In other words, he wasn't the sort of person to believe in cosmic monsters. Talk of aliens in those days was purely theoretical. The UFO thing really didn't get started until the late 1940s, although it's present throughout history, but it wasn't a big topic on the minds of a lot of people. In Lovecraft's letters, which have all been published in 5 volumes, believe it or not, he wrote far more letters than he did stories. He writes again and again that he is a strict scientific materialist, someone who believes that everything comes down to matter and energy in the good old 18th and 19th century senses of those words. I don't know if there are too many of those left, scientific materialists. A lot of the atheists we talk to, or the super skeptics, as I refer to them, who sometimes will criticize all the stuff that goes on in paranormal research, and rightly so in many cases, very often are, I think, probably among the final holdouts of the idea that everything is really based on matter, and that there's not something beyond that. They tend to be atheistic, non-believers in God, even though quantum mechanics is kind of blowing all that out of the water now, showing that there's a lot more to the universe or the multiverse than there previously had been thought to be. So he was one of them anyway. Again, and having living in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, that was not an unusual position at all. So anyway, Lovecraft loved to read, and he loved to write. But his short stories reflect a world, indeed a multiverse, that is so opposite from his personal beliefs that many people who didn't know him didn't know whether to take him seriously or not. Amidst all his reading, Lovecraft came across the early writings of those who pioneered quantum physics, named a couple of minutes ago, whose roots reach back to 1838 and the work of Michael Faraday. So while Lovecraft might not have heard of the multiverse theories of Everett in the late 1950s, or some of the advancements that have been made in quantum physics, he certainly knew about quantum physics. He mentions it in some of his letters, because it started way back in 1838. And was developed from there. And there were some jumps ahead with Niels Bohr and Heisenberg around the turn of the 20th century. So he was a guy who was well up on his science and knew about that. So anyway, the roots of our modern quantum concepts of the multiverse would have been discernible in books that Lovecraft might have read. Now, he was no math genius, as far as we know, but he was very interested in science. As a matter of fact, when he was a kid, he had a chemistry set and nearly blew his finger off. Fortunately, he had an uncle who was a doctor who saved the thing. Yeah, so
they give you plutonium in like the kids' chemistry sets.
Well, practically, I remember I had a chemistry set when I was a kid. And I almost blew up the room, and my mother Grandma took it away from me. So,
oh, too bad.
But I mean, it's stuff you'd never see today. To me, the only fun in physics is blowing the place up. I'm not physics in chemistry was blowing the place up.
In physics, using math to blow things up.
I remember when I was in. I suppose I don't know if this Lovecraft felt the same way or not, but science really can be fun. There was when I attended the St. Thomas Seminary, the first seminary I attended in Connecticut, there was most of the classes were taught by priests, and we had one who would teach, who had a science degree, and he would teach chemistry, and a few other things. And so he was demonstrating at one time the how an electrical current will get carried through a group of people. But he said, whatever you do, don't grab my hand, don't close the circle, or the last person gets a shock. So we all had it around, and I was the last person in line, and I kind of sneaked over and I kind of grabbed his hand. He went, "Whoa,"
Yeah.
So I was not. Things like that did not endear me to the seminary faculties. In any case, Lovecraft loved his science and had lots of fun, or attempted to, with his science kits.
Terrorizing seminary teachers.
So I can easily imagine that, as happened to me when I encountered quantum concepts in the 1970s while doing ghost research, Lovecraft uttered a great aha when he encountered those ideas in the midst of his work on fantasy and horror fiction. And as Ben said before, he was one of the first authors, certainly in the 20th century, to apply the ideas of these utterly alien, utterly outside worlds and creatures to fiction. He got away from ghosts and vampires and the usual swill that people would write about into something entirely different. That's what really made him famous later on. So in that fiction, Lovecraft was fascinated by the idea of ultimate outsideness, as we said, the ultimate other. The basis of his major stories is the idea, almost unique in literature up to that time, that long before humans existed, the earth was ruled by utterly alien beings from outside, with a capital O. Even the physics of these critters was utterly different. Early man worshipped them as gods, but humanity itself was completely irrelevant in the scenario. I often wonder, Ben, coming out of the 1930s when, a gentleman did not leave the house without a tie and a jacket on and a hat, and living in a very orderly society in which everybody pretty much knew what they were supposed to do and who they were and what their pecking order in society was, that this idea of utterly alien outsideness and the idea that these things could wipe away man at the drop of a hat, not think any more about it than us stepping on an anthill, could have been kind of an intriguing thought.
Yeah, well, considering it was like you had the whole spiritualist thing going on, I'm trying to think of how to word it because people thought of things in a different way.
Yeah, he rejected that. I remember, I guess he never went to the seminary, of course, but he was excused from Sunday school because he would ask questions like, and I guess he was, I guess his family was Baptist by denomination, and as a matter of fact, they attended that beautiful First Baptist Church in Providence, which was with the beautiful steeple designed by Christopher Wren
yep.
at the bottom of the hill below the Brown University campus, and which is the area where he lived most of his life. And he would go to Sunday school there and ask questions like, okay, well, where did Mrs. Kane come from? And, things like that.
Oh,
and,
Lillian.
And, at this stage today, it doesn't, that's kind of a silly question because that's all, and anyway, I don't know. It depends. They must have been semi-fundamentalists as far as the Bible was concerned, but I guess they quietly requested that his mother and his grandfather keep him out of Sunday school. Confusing everybody, but I must confess to have done a few things like that in my.
The thing is, that is a really
career.
interesting concept, that he came up with. That what if we just don't matter to these these ginormous beings?
Yeah,
and it's kind of interesting because everyone at the time was like, oh yeah, God totally cares about me and just me alone. And then
especially today when everybody's a VIP. We've come through our school system, and I'm okay, you're okay. Everybody gets a trophy, and then you hit real life, quote unquote, and it doesn't work that way. And everybody's mad and wants the socialist workers' paradise to dawn, or the socialist non-workers' paradise, and I don't know. So but that was a different age. And if you really wanted to shake somebody up, you would question, the basics of reality. Lovecraft himself wrote a brilliant piece of nonfiction. It was an essay called Supernatural Horror and Fiction, and he said he pointed out there's a very thin line between humor and horror, and nothing is more terrifying to the human spirit than a displacement in time and space. Very simple, and we run into that all the time. That's the basis of our work in paranormal research because. When you look at what goes on in this house or that house, it's a disjointedness in time and space.
Well, apparently, the reason why we laugh is because we find something incredible. It's you wouldn't normally see that. Let's say, you have a really stupid joke like, 2 peanuts walk into a bar, one was assaulted. And it's like, peanuts don't walk into a bar, peanuts can't even move. So you think it's funny because it just doesn't make sense. So things that don't make sense are either funny or completely terrifying.
Yeah, no, it's true. That's the among the vagaries of the human mind, the human psychology. So, in any case, but funny, at no point does Lovecraft have these beings, and they vary what they're called from story to story. You've always got Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and guys like that, but you've got the old ones, the great old ones, and the other gods and things of this kind. And again, it depends on the story. Now, Lovecraft's more had several friends who were crazy about organizing everything, and especially August Derleth, who was a young writer from Wisconsin who corresponded with Lovecraft. Never met him, but took it upon himself after Lovecraft died to sort of become Lovecraft's, successor or whatever. And but in fairness, and he really wasn't a very good writer in my opinion, but what he did do was to preserve and publish Lovecraft's works, several of which had never seen print before. And were it not for August Derleth, regardless of what you think of him and his writing, we might never have heard of Lovecraft. But in any case, he tried to take the Cthulhu mythos, as it's called, or the Lovecraft mythos, all these ideas about these weird gods and all the strange things they did, and he tried to organize them by name and by category, and Lovecraft really never intended that to happen. He wrote each story independently of every other story.
Yeah, they just happened.
So another bit of evidence that maybe he didn't know anything special, and that this was really...
He just had a great imagination.
He had a tremendous imagination. He was able to put two and two together, and so I think, but again, it's very much like quantum mechanics, because the physics of these creatures was very different, and quantum mechanics suggests that from universe to universe, if that's how it's organized, the physics may be very different, one to the other. So, anyway, this theme carries on to the idea that these great old ones or whatever, depending on the story, would someday not only used to rule the earth, but would someday return and take over the earth again, very probably wiping out humanity in the process.
So when his stories started to appear in the pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s, especially the great Weird Tales magazine, Lovecraft got a huge charge out of the readers who took them seriously. And many readers wrote in and wanted to know where Lovecraft got his knowledge and where they could get copies of the forbidden books he talked about in the stories. I don't want to know where to get the Necronomicon.
I know. Well, there's a funny story that... Well, first of all, Lovecraft kind of had a low opinion of the readers of the pulp magazine. They called them pulp magazines because they were made from the cheapest possible paper. And I loved your grandmother very much, but there's one thing I'll never forget her for. Your grandfather had, the one who supposedly corresponded with Lovecraft, had a complete collection, start to finish, I think it was 1919 to 1952 or 53, of every single issue of Weird Tales magazine, which is considered the classic magazine in American literary history where all these people got their start.
That would be worth like a fortune today.
Approximately $10,000, I'm told. Threw it all away. So anyway, it took a great deal to forgive her for that, but she didn't know. Anyway, well, all the things that might have been.
Indeed.
Some of the more intelligent fans who wrote to Lovecraft eventually became his good friends because they'd read his stories in Weird Tales, realized they were really a cut above everything else that was in Weird Tales, and they wrote right to him. They eventually formed the Lovecraft Circle, as literary scholars call them, and these included a number of young people who would go on to become famous writers themselves, such as Robert E. Howard, creator of the Conan the Barbarian stories.
Oh, yes.
And the great science fiction writer Robert Bloch, who, along with many short stories and books, wrote a number of the Star Trek scripts in the 1960s.
And Lovecraft's friends found that he was very much the proper gentleman. But once he got to know you and let his hair down, so to speak, he turned out to be a loyal friend and a really funny guy, and with that zany sense of humor that comes only from people with high intelligence.
Now, one indication that Lovecraft's fictional worlds really were fictional, on top of what we said, is that except for the theme of this utter outsideness we just mentioned, there was very little consistency among the characters and scenarios from story to story. And we were just talking about that. Those lovable guys, Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and a few others appear or are mentioned in a number of stories.
Or Nyarlathotep, the Crawling Chaos.
The Crawling Chaos, I like that.
Yes.
I'm sure it seems familiar today. And there were also the sunken cyclopean cities, as they call. But that's about as far as it goes with what is known as the Lovecraft mythos. And as I say, Derleth and others tried to codify that, and they wrote stories based on it. But Lovecraft always enjoyed it when his friends wrote stories with new beings from this mythos, and excuse me, and new cities and new scenarios. He thought that was great. So, had he really known something about this, you'd think that would have annoyed him more than anything else. Okay, we're going to take a commercial break here, and we're right back on Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and ONWorldwide.com. Stay with us.
Hi, everybody. This is Mark Garrow, the host of PRN's Garage Pass, where I keep you up to date with all the latest NASCAR racing news. Garage Pass can be heard right here on WOON every Tuesday through Saturday mornings at 7:35 and is sponsored by Simon Chevrolet, 114 Fortin Drive, Woonsocket. Remember, Simon Chevrolet is always open online at simonchevy.com. Garage Pass, Simon Chevrolet, and WOON Woonsocket Radio. A winning combination.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
And here we are again, and I wanted to remind you about Amazon Kindle and Amazon Kindle Fire, these wonderful e-reader devices you can use to read everything from books, magazines, and newspapers to, when you get to the upper end Kindle device, certainly the Kindle Fire you can download as well, games, apps, and all sorts of marvelous things in full color. And it's only $199. The lower-end devices, if you're just interested in reading, as low as $79 for the Amazon Kindle Reader. Check it out at Amazon.com and at Staples as well, and you'll find a whole new world opening to you, especially if you live in a small place and can't afford huge numbers of books and a library. This is your library right in your hand. So take advantage of it. Amazon Kindle and Amazon Kindle Fire. Okay, and welcome back. And we're talking this evening about H.P. Lovecraft, the great Rhode Island writer of horror stories and science fiction and fantasy of the 20th century, who was a distant relative of Ben's and mine. And many people have speculated that the utterly alien and different things he wrote about and the books he referred to were real, and that he had some secret knowledge of this. And
I'm sure some people still think that today. I mean, I've heard stories like people going to sacrifice animals on his grave.
It's pretty grim. Yeah, he's buried at, shouldn't even say Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, with Rhode Island's distinguished personalities from history. And I don't know, he himself would be disgusted by some of the things that people think about what he believed. And I think, although there was one occasion, or one of his friends, I should have looked it up, I can't remember the name of the friend, but went into an old bookstore in New York. And there was a very spooky old lady who was running the place. And he said to her, just as a joke, "Oh, do you happen to have the Necronomicon?" One of these fictional books. And she said, "Oh, yes, just over here." And it gave him quite a start. And it turned out it was a mistake, but Lovecraft, got a big kick out of that. He said, it's good to, So these are the sorts of things that happen. But his friends knew that this stuff was made up. And the in-jokes that resulted from the stories are really something that are a riot. Matter of fact, they had great fun with these in-jokes, and they really enjoyed inventing new monsters for the Lovecraft mythos and using them to annihilate each other. For example, in Lovecraft's 1935 story, The Haunter of the Dark, Lovecraft takes his room and its westward view in his own house on College Hill in Providence and puts it in the story, and he uses it as the scene to demolish his good friend, the aforementioned Robert Bloch, who in the story is called Robert Blake. Now, it's funny, that was based on...
It's not very imaginative.
Oh, no, but they had great... And, of course, the readers of Weird... These were all published in, Weird Tales and sometimes Amazing Stories and other pulp magazines of the time. But the readers had no idea what was going on. They thought these things that were real or just really good. And they were writing about each other. And there was one, I think it was in one of Bloch's stories, there was the Atlantean high priest HPL, which of course based on HPL, his Lovecraft's initials. So they just had a great time with this stuff. You know, it's funny that the steeple and the church in that story, the Haunter of the Dark, was visible from pretty much all over Providence, and it was a very spooky-looking place. It was torn down in the late 1990s, but it was one of the Catholic churches on Federal Hill in Providence. Providence has the two major hills, College Hill, where Brown University is and where Lovecraft lived, and then visible in the west is Federal Hill, which started out, believe it or not, as the Irish section in the 1840s, and is now to this day is famous for the Italian restaurants and the big Italian churches that were built in the 1920s. So just about everything Lovecraft writes about in Providence and in New England is based on something real, apparently except for the actual monsters and the actual multiversal situations that go on.
Indeed.
But anyway, Lovecraft's population has grown tremendously in recent decades. But then again, as that has grown, the more people seem to be convinced that his stories reflect some dark knowledge and terrifying reality.
So, those people must be dorks, right? Well, not so fast.
Not so fast. Let's look at this again. When you really consider how quantum concepts have developed, and when I think how Ben and I applied these theoretical ideas in the paranormal trenches, the horizon starts to look a little bit ominous. Everett's theory of multiple worlds, the graduate student, the guy in 1957 who came up with this multiple worlds idea, led to the idea, as we mentioned before, that every possible world is real, somewhere or somewhen in this unimaginably vast, interactive system of parallel worlds that we call the multiverse. We imagine, we dream, we create, we remember, based entirely on the notion that our subconscious embraces the whole of the multiverse. That's how big we really are. And that implies that Lovecraft, profound materialist that he was in his own beliefs, would never have been able to conceive of Cthulhu or the Outer Hells or Nyarlathotep or anybody else we've mentioned tonight, or anything else in his fiction for that matter, if something like them did not in fact exist in one or more real worlds. Now, it's kind of hard to get our minds around that if we're not used to thinking about the multiverse. That doesn't mean those things are real here, or that Cthulhu or somebody could come blasting through some world boundary and eat New York. I mean, sure, anything is possible, but the laws of the multiverse, at least of our own consciousness, don't seem to admit that sort of thing. But taken to its logical or illogical conclusion, that is what quantum mechanics suggests. Now, for us, meaning Ben and myself, this is far more than theory. Now, I've been at this for 42 years, and Ben has been at it for almost 8. We do not do drugs. We do not have overactive imaginations. I think we function with great success in our private and public lives with our feet on the ground. But in the course of our work in the paranormal trenches, as I say, and indeed in the course of 2 daily lives that are shot through with multiverse awareness, simply because we live with this stuff, we see the multiverse in action. In our cases, we have encountered creatures that seem utterly other.
So as can be said for many billion people, Lovecraft could have been far closer to the truth, or at least the truth for some worlds, than he realized.
And but I don't think he realized it. I think that's the key. So anyway, let's put this in context. Physics has given us such insight into the nature of reality that some people are having trouble keeping their bearings. As with Lovecraft characters who learn too much about reality and go insane, several of the stories begin by people being in psychiatric hospitals. People write to us all the time because they are becoming more multiverse aware and feel they can't handle it. And why are they becoming more multiverse aware? Well, one of our theories is that because of the astronomical alignments, which reminds me of the Cthulhu mythos that talks about that. Astronomical situation in the neighborhood here, the galactic neighborhood. There are a lot of loose and very strong electromagnetic pulses coming and going, and we feel this affects human behavior. We had a show on that last night on CBS. Anyway, Some people just can't handle the thinning boundaries, if that's what it is, and the things that are occurring. Other people are just the opposite. They feel glorified by it. Now, what I'm saying there is that people are writing to us, people are saying that they're professional people, they're business people, well-educated, but yet one fellow was driving by a house. It was one color one day, and all of a sudden the next day I think it was blue, right? Had been red. And the owner of the house, whom he happened to know, said, "What are you talking about? It's been red for years. It's been blue for years." Things like that. Or people, one woman wrote to us that she walked into the kitchen and saw herself sitting at the kitchen counter. Very common, and becoming more so. People saying the cat ran in, it was a different color than it was yesterday. I myself woke up and had a lot, because this is maybe means I'm getting younger, had a lot more black in my beard one day than I remembered from the previous day.
It actually looked kind of brown.
Really? Yeah. See, it was completely white before. But you wouldn't remember that because you are still carrying on in that same universe.
Yeah, because your beard's not completely white.
So, but this seems to be how, nutty as it sounds, this is how it seems the universe seems to be constructed. And theologically...
An ordered chaos of sorts.
Yes. That's really quite elegant. But theologically, we say, well, hey, what greater... If the creation is the result of God's love is infinite, so you create an infinite creation, all possibilities, not just one. So that's how I look at it theologically.
Interesting theological statement.
Anyway, physics has also given us the ability, on the other side of the coin, to destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons. And this brings about a fate every bit as horrible, cosmic, and complete as anything envisioned in Lovecraft's fiction. If you agree with us on nothing else, you certainly can't deny that that's real. The more quantum physics has taught us about what we really are and where we really live, the more Lovecraft's worlds of inexpressible beauty and of indescribable horror take on a reality and depth even he might not be able to imagine.
Or maybe he can. If we read multiverse, if we're reading the multiverse theory correctly, there are many parallel worlds in which Lovecraft never died.
Exactly. Many worlds in which the old gentleman of Providence, as he liked to talk to himself, still gazes out his window at the westward roofs of that city, bathed in the sunsets he loves so much, contemplating mysteries within mysteries that could be true after all.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Depending on your point of view.
I'm sorry, what?
So, anyway, we'll just wondering if we have a caller here. Do we have a caller?
We do, and
Perfect
it's
timing.
Oh God, it's Bill from Franklin.
Oh, very good. We got it. Bill from Franklin, welcome to the show.
Hello.
How you doing?
I had something happen to me off and on that I'm not sure if it's connected or not. They call it deja vu.
Oh yeah.
Like I'm walking into a room and for a split second, everything in the room is in the same spot, and I've been here before, and I've done this, and then it's gone.
Exactly. That's very common. That happens to me.
I get that a lot.
Yeah. Well, people say nobody really understands that. We would say, as you can guess, that you really have been there and had done that or are doing it in a parallel life, and that seems to be how it works.
And Joe Ferrier said that when I told him, he said he had the same experience.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go, Joe. Yeah. Well, Joe was very interested in our ideas, and we're very proud to have known him and been able to share the ideas with him. But he was an intelligent enough guy to come up with that on his own too.
I saw you on TV the other day.
On the
History Channel.
Oh yeah, the immortality through reruns.
This was about the Hurricane of '38.
Oh no, New England's killer hurricane. Yeah, I was. I got some FaceTime in that.
You were a historian in it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you never know where I'm going to turn up, Bill.
I saw you. Oh, I know who that is.
yeah, I know that guy. Well, it's funny, I've been in several History Channel features, and it's funny, I've been on TV mostly as a historian rather than as a paranormal investigator, which is probably just as well given some of the shows. But, it was fun doing that. It's funny, where I was talking about the incidents in Jamestown, and we filmed that up in Quincy. So why they did that, I don't know, but it was fun to do.
I don't know much about H.P. Lovecraft. This is interesting.
It is. He was one of the strangest people around, and I refer to him in my book, Rhode Island: A Genial History, as Rhode Island's greatest lover, which is ironic because he only got married once, and he didn't seem to be very interested in women. I mean, he was straight, but I mean, because he married somebody, but or whatever. There's no indication. But I call him Rhode Island's greatest lover because he loved Rhode Island so much, and he loved Providence. On his gravestone in Swan Point Cemetery, it says a quote from one of his letters: "I am Providence."
Oh yeah.
So he was
I think there's a rock and roll band by that name, isn't there? Lovecraft or something.
Oh yeah, the name
there is.
and the ideas have spread out throughout human culture. As a matter of fact, in the Pirates of the Caribbean, the most recent movie, Ben's better at movies than I am, but there's
I know the band you're talking about. They're terrible. They're like a death metal band. They're awful.
Oh yeah, well in the movie though, it's I guess it's supposed to be Davy Jones, and he's got the tentacles on his face. That's what Cthulhu was supposed to look like.
A pirate.
Yeah, well, yeah, he wore the pirate hat, but he certainly had the tentacles and kind of non-human look like that. So Lovecraft's ideas have spread all over literature and the movies.
Okay. Very interesting. I just wanted to make a brief comment.
Oh, glad you did, Bill. Okay, talk to you again.
Always
Take
welcome.
Okay.
care. Always welcome.
Have a good one.
Okay, very good. So there's an interesting letter here from Peggy Ray. I guess that's not her last, in Seattle about Lovecraft.
Okay, so Peggy writes to us. I have read Lovecraft's collected letters, and he obviously detested religion. You, on the other hand, are obviously believers, and I wouldn't go that far. If you were to talk to Lovecraft about God, what would you say?
Okay, well, I certainly am a believer in God. As a matter of fact, I always honor the Roman Catholic Church because that's where I learned to love God.
I wouldn't consider myself religious. I'd consider myself spiritual, but I do believe.
Yeah, there is.
I believe in the same thing as you, basically.
Yeah,
sort of.
You and I are different critters, but
yeah,
there is a difference between being spiritual and being religious. From what Lovecraft knew, but he would go on for whole letters about being an atheist. I suppose on the other hand, though, he would talk very solicitously about the church. He believed that religion and the church in particular were great forces for establishing moral behavior and regularity in society. Okay, and we're looking around at society today. One might think he had a point. Because on the other hand, you want to have a positive spiritual. You don't want religion based on fear, because it should be based on love. And ironically, in some of our paranormal cases, we run into people whose spirituality is regular but based on fear rather than love. They have more paranormal problems than most people do. Anyway, that's I guess for another show. But anyway, Peggy, how would I talk to Lovecraft about God? Well, I don't know if I would, but I would look for an opportunity to. Given the state of knowledge that he had, and again, I don't think he had any special knowledge about strange realms or creatures. I think he just had a great imagination and a little bit of scientific information that he played upon. Given the state of knowledge of the 1920s and 1930s, science really was entirely based on this scientific materialism. When you look back at it, it really was quite arrogant and very narrow, and assuming the epistemology of that we always question. Epistemology is what we know and how we know it. So I think with Lovecraft, if I took the argument that we really don't know anything, that we can't trust our five physical senses, and of course what quantum physics has found out today about what is beyond us, what is beyond our bodies, what is beyond our senses, he might have begun to listen. Because he did make the distinction between religion and belief in God. Now I might correct myself there. I'm not sure that he really did. When people's whole experience of God is an oppressive spirituality, a negative spirituality, a mean, nasty, dry-mouthed old preacher, bellowing in his barn-like church, I mean, that would put me off too. I know of several very, very frustrated people because they're frustrated. They're frustrated because they are atheists and yet have a spiritual temperament. They have a religious temperament. They're the kinds of people who would respond to what I guess today is known as the God gene, that bit of our DNA that is now being studied that seems to contain messages from someone at our creation that we are Homo Moderans.
Well, the thing is, H.P. Lovecraft's not like everybody today, because if someone's an atheist today and you go up to them like, oh, hey, let's have a debate about this, they'd be like, you're wrong, or the other way around, because people don't know how to debate anymore. It's just, I'm right, you're wrong, shut up, go home.
That's a very good point.
So H.P. Lovecraft would probably be like, all right, well, let's sit down and have a chat about this, have a little bit of tea.
Yep.
And we
love coffee with 4 scoops of sugar in it.
Sounds like Grandma.
Yeah, exactly.
But, no, if he seems like a level-headed guy. I mean, a little odd, but level-headed guy, as like some people were back then. A lot of great thinkers are usually level-headed people. Mm-hmm. So one could assume that the argument was never made that, well, what if we don't really know?
You're right, because they thought they knew everything. The whole attitude came out of the Enlightenment, this period in the so-called Enlightenment, period in Europe in the 18th century, where people believed that everything was the universe was a big machine, all right, and that if you could find out how all the parts worked, you could not only understand the whole, you could predict the future, because the whole thing was a big machine. You know, you could predict where it would be in 20 years. Now, that seems to be rather silly, because it's a lot more than a big machine. But that's the attitude that Lovecraft had. But he was intellectually honest. He wouldn't just say, as you say, that you're wrong. You could have a debate with him. And there were several times in his life when he changed his attitude and he changed his point of view because someone gave him a good argument in favor of that point of view. That's why I respect his intelligence, because he realized that there are things he didn't know, and that if you get better information, you change your point of view. And I don't know how many people today would do that. Because usually I do not respect the intelligence of atheists, because why should they miss the whole point of the universe? That's my opinion. But someone like Lovecraft, I think, could be. You could have an intelligent debate with him on this. He might not change his mind, but I think he would be interested in some of these.
Well, the thing
arguments.
is, you could exchange ideas without it getting into a heated argument.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Which is, you don't really find that often anymore.
I think he would respect the. Sort of this apophatic epistemology argument, the sort of argument from what we don't know. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, Peggy, but that seems to be some sort of an approach that I think that I might have taken with my dear cousin had I known him.
Yeah, well, you can't put 21st century restrictions on 20th century people.
That's another thing with him. He is looked back upon by many critics as a renowned racist. Okay.
Oh yeah, I had a friend who said that. I was like, oh, I like H.P. Lovecraft. He was like, he's racist, and I was like, well, so is everybody else.
So was everybody else. That was normal from the 1920s and 30s. I can't stand it. Speaking as a historian, I can't stand it when people take 21st century ideas and principles and standards and impose them upon people from the past. It's not fair.
Not saying it's not. It's that it's right for
them
to be like.
I'm not saying it's right, but it's not fair.
Yeah, exactly.
That's and in Lovecraft's case, it's especially unfair because it's not true. Not entirely true. The older he got, and this is again why I respect his intelligence. The older he got, the more he learned. I mean, he would go on about this group or that group, but he married a woman who was a Ukrainian Jew, in her own right, a brilliant writer, and a wonderful person by all accounts. And then, beyond that, he welcomed into his circle of friends more and more people of different backgrounds. And if you said to them he was a racist, they'd say, what? This is the warmest, most wonderful guy, most loyal friend, perfect gentleman you'd ever want to meet. So by the end of his life, he really became a socialist in the Roosevelt sense of the word, not in the modern sense of the word.
Wait, FDR or TR?
FDR.
Okay.
Yeah, Franklin Roosevelt. Because remember, he was living during the Depression, and anybody with a heart during the Depression pretty much became a socialist, because they didn't. they didn't think of the practicalities. They just thought of they saw the robber barons, and they saw the worst of capitalism. Because, I think anybody would agree capitalism needs to be supervised.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, as long as you have intelligent leadership who's gotten their hands dirty at some point. That's not the point of the show. But anyway, Lovecraft became less and less racist until by the end of his life, I don't think you could even call him that. So it's not fair to really say that he was a lifelong racist, because I don't believe that was true.
Indeed. It just bothers me so much when people do that, because it I had a history class where people would be like, oh, why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? I was like, that's just what they did. That's just how their society was.
Well, people today often think very two-dimensionally. We're not well informed. People are not well educated. I don't know. I don't know why people are coming out of schools like that, but I could just see some of the teachers having to spend a lot of time maintaining discipline rather than teaching. And let's admit, I mean, there are people in every field who aren't quite up to the job, and that must include some teachers. Although there are some teachers I'll never forget, et cetera, et cetera. So in any case, Lovecraft was the product of his time, and I think he was ahead of his time, perhaps even socially and morally and spiritually, in a way, just as he was scientifically, by his use of the multiverse ideas. Now, again, posthumous analysis of any kind is always dangerous.
Yeah.
But and there will be. We had hoped actually this evening to have Dr. Niels Hobb from University of Rhode Island come up, but it was very spur of the moment, and he was not able to be here.
The infamous traffic on 95.
Oh gosh,
that was
it's because we're at the other end of the state from URI, because albeit the state is only 48 miles long, but nevertheless. So Dr. Hobbs is going to. Is one of the organizers of the Necronomicon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, I heard about that, actually.
2013. Yeah.
You know what's funny? I actually had a friend who invited a bunch of us to that. And
Really?
Yeah. I heard something about it before, and then you mentioned it, and I was like, wait, what?
I happened to run into August of next year, 2013.
Yeah.
The conference will occur in Providence, and I remember that I, as a member of the press, went to the World Fantasy Convention in 1979 at that very location, and they would have it in Providence every 5 years in honor of Lovecraft.
Yeah.
So this, I'm looking forward to this. We're working on a few things. Ben and I might be involved in that conference in some way, and still in the discussion stages on that. And we will in future have Dr. Hobbs on the show to promote this conference. So there we are. So anyway, let's get to our announcements.
All right.
We're out of time.
So the next up on our tour, our public appearances, we have town hall style meetings in Woodbridge, Suffolk, England on Saturday, September 22nd, and we will present our program Exploring the Paranormal with CBS Radio's Paul and Ben Eno and WOON at the Grove House Hotel in Woodbridge, Suffolk, England. From 7 to 11 p.m. Tickets are £11 per person and will include...
£15.
15. Sorry, I saw 11 p.m.
A little bit of deflation.
So, £15 per person and will include a full buffet dinner courtesy of the hotel, and profits will go to local charities. So this event will take place in a highly active paranormal area, which was the scene of the famous Rendlesham Forest UFO incidents of 1980. And Larry Warren, who was a witness to these events and co-author of the book Left at East Gate, plans to be with us that evening as well. So more information and to buy the tickets, visit www.spaceportuk.com-events.html or just go to behindtheparanormal.com and look for the link to the site under What's New. And finally, my dad and I will be featured speakers at the All Hallows Eve Psychic Fair at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Warwick, Rhode Island on Sunday, October 28th. So watch for more info on these events and more at www.behindtheparanormal.com.
And stay tuned for news, as I say, on the Necronomicon Providence we just talked about. We'll be talking more about that as we go. Certainly check our show website, behindtheparanormal.com. We have hours and hours and hours. I think if you want to listen to all of our shows, it would take you about 520 hours to do so, but hey, get started. You can also buy my books, subscribe to our newsletter, and or apply to become a reporter on the site.
Yeah, you can also download the podcast, put them onto your iPod or something. You can listen to them like that.
So many thanks to our producer, Ben himself, who's doing a fine job at that. And we won't see you next Monday, September 3rd. It's Labor Day in the USA, and So why labor? Ironically, Ben and I will be taking the day off, and the show will be a rebroadcast.
So on our regular CBS radio edition on Sunday, September 22nd, in Boston...
Second.
Yeah, 2nd. Sorry. I don't know what time... I don't know where
You're thinking of our UK trip.
I am.
We're coming back.
I am. In Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Seattle, we'll be doing a rebroadcast.
Appropriately, we leave you this evening with a thought from H.P. Lovecraft himself. Quote, I never ask a man what his business is, for it never interests me. What I ask him about are his thoughts and dreams.
So thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we will see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.